Every anchor on cable that afternoon called it a standard panel debate. Nobody caught what happened in the last 4 minutes before the cameras cut. Nobody had warned the studio about the folder. Not the producer who had booked the segment. Not the booker who had confirmed Karoline Leavitt's appearance at 10 a.m. that morning. Not the floor director who had worked the set for 9 years and believed, as of the Tuesday afternoon taping, that he had seen every possible version of a political panel go sideways. The folder was not in the pre-show briefing notes. It was not part of the agreed topic list. Nobody in the building, until it appeared on the table between the two women, knew it existed. 3 hours later, the clip was running on every major platform, but none of them ran the part that mattered most. The segment had been framed as a conversation about legislative credentials, who brings what to Washington, and whether biography translates to effectiveness. It was the kind of question that both women had been asked versions of before. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in American history, a communications professional who had built her career inside the machinery of executive power without once appearing on a ballot, and Jasmine Crockett, a licensed attorney, former criminal defense lawyer, and sitting Texas congresswoman whose entry into public life had been built case by case in courtrooms where the stakes were someone's freedom. On paper, the segment looked like a clean exchange of opposing positions, the kind that produces 4-minute clips and 15 minutes of Twitter engagement. What the paper didn't contain was the law degree. Now, a different room 6 months earlier, a congressional hearing, morning light through institutional windows, Crockett at the dais with a legal pad in front of her and a quality of stillness around her that the people who know her recognize as preparation fully arrived. She had been a criminal defense attorney. She had stood in rooms where silence was a weapon and every word chosen badly was a cost someone else paid. She knew how questions worked, not the surface of them, but the architecture beneath. The geometry of a question that looks like an inquiry but functions like a corner, the way it eliminates exits one by one until the only direction left is the truth. She had built those questions for years before she ever ran for office. She had simply never stopped building them. The moderator opened the segment at 2:43 p.m. with the standard framing, 2 perspectives on political effectiveness. Leavitt was seated to the left. Her posture was the same posture it always is, exact, controlled, occupying exactly the amount of space she has decided to occupy and no more. She had prepared. She had her answers organized the way a person organizes luggage before a flight, efficiently, in advance, nothing left to chance. She acknowledged the moderator with a brief nod and settled into the opening exchange with the ease of someone who has done this particular thing 100 times. Crockett was quiet beside her, not nervous quiet, the other kind. Then, and this was the moment that none of the coverage captured correctly, Leavitt said the thing about the law degree. It wasn't the centerpiece of her argument. It was a parenthetical, a throwaway, delivered the way a confident person delivers something they believe is obvious, with the lightness of a statement that doesn't require defense. She had been making a point about grassroots connection, about the difference between legal theory and political reality, and she dropped the phrase with a slight upward inflection, almost, but not quite, a laugh, that was clearly designed to diminish without directly attacking, the kind of line that does its damage in the subtext. Courtroom training, she said. Not disparagingly enough to be called out directly, but dismissively enough that everyone in the room understood the register. She was smiling slightly when she said it. Crockett did not react visibly. Her expression didn't change. Her hands didn't move. The only thing that shifted was the quality of her attention. A minute tightening of focus, the way a lens adjusts when the subject clarifies itself. Then she reached under the table. The folder she placed on the surface was thin, manila, worn slightly at the corners, the kind of wear that comes from being handled repeatedly rather than from age. She didn't open it immediately. She placed it on the table with the deliberate, unhurried care of a woman who had decided exactly when and how this moment would happen, and had simply been waiting for the invitation. She looked at Leavitt, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with the flat, complete attention of someone who has arrived at the center of a thing they have been moving toward for a long time. The eye contact was not aggressive. It was total. It held Leavitt without moving, the way a spotlight holds without touching. Leavitt's smile completed itself and then stopped. Not dropped, stopped. The way a song stops when the power cuts. Then, back to the other room. 6 months earlier, the hearing. A witness at the far end of the table. A housing administrator, 11 years with the district. A woman who had walked into the building that morning, with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes on the floor. She sat down with the particular posture of someone who has been asked to be somewhere they did not choose. Before Crockett asked her a single question, she simply looked at the woman for 3 full seconds. Not reassuringly, not with visible sympathy. Just looked. The way you look at something you recognize and want the other person to know you recognize. The witness's shoulders, which had been raised slightly since she sat down, dropped a fraction of an inch. Crockett then asked about a specific statute. She named the section. She named the subsection. She named the implementation date and the reporting requirement attached to it. She asked whether the requirement had been met. The witness said no. Crockett said, "Tell me what that cost." The witness told her. It took 4 minutes. Nobody interrupted. That was what the law degree looked like from the inside. Back to the panel. The folder opened now, not thrown open, but turned to a specific page with the particular efficiency of someone who has already been to this page many times. On it, a summary document, a case record. Names redacted, dates intact, outcomes annotated in the margin in a hand that was clearly Crockett's. Small, precise letters, the kind made by someone writing quickly but completely. She laid it flat. She did not push it toward Leavitt. She simply made it visible. Then she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was lower than it had been for the first 12 minutes of the segment. Not louder, lower and slower, the way a river slows when it approaches something it cannot go around. She did not raise the dismissiveness of Leavitt's earlier comment directly. She didn't have to. She simply described the case on the page, a specific family, a specific legal situation, a specific outcome that had been achieved not through political access or administrative connection, but through a working knowledge of the law that had been tested in a courtroom against a real opposing counsel, with a real judge evaluating every argument in real time. She said the phrase once, quietly, almost academically, that the geometry of a case doesn't change because the room it's argued in changes. She said it was one of the first things she had learned in practice, that the statute says what it says regardless of who's reading it. That training exists not to impress, but to protect. And then she placed her hand flat on the summary sheet, looked at Leavitt with the same total attention as before, and asked a question that had nothing to do with the document and everything to do with what the document represented. She asked when, in Leavitt's career, she had last been accountable for being wrong, not failing, not losing a news cycle, not drawing criticism from the opposition. Accountable. The word landed with a weight that required a moment to register. A woman in the front of the studio audience pressed 2 fingers against her lower lip and held them there. A man near the back leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his eyes fixed on a point 6 inches in front of him. Leavitt's breathing was visible. Her jaw was tight, not clenched, but held, the way a structure is held when weight is applied that wasn't anticipated in the design. Her eyes, which had been moving with their usual precision between Crockett, the moderator, and the camera, went still. They fixed on the middle distance for 1.8 seconds, long enough for 4 cameras to catch it, short enough that she could reasonably claim it hadn't happened, and then returned to Crockett. She answered. She spoke about accountability in the context of public service. She spoke about the administration's record. She organized her response with the efficiency of long practice. The words were correct. The framing was sound. But the geometry of the room had shifted, invisibly to a casual viewer, completely to anyone watching closely. And her answer, however precisely constructed, was filling a space that the question had already redefined. She was arguing the shape of a room that Crockett had already changed the dimensions of. The summary sheet lay on the table between them the entire time Leavitt spoke. She didn't look at it. Crockett waited until Leavitt finished. Then she lifted the summary sheet. Just lifted it, without drama, the way you close a book you finished reading. Slid it back into the folder and closed the folder. She did not reopen it. She placed her hands back in her lap. She looked at the moderator and indicated, with a slight nod, that she was done. The segment had 45 seconds left on its clock. Nobody used them. Afterward, the hallway outside the studio. Leavitt's communications aide had been typing since before the segment ended. 3 messages sent before the cameras cut. A 4th one that autocorrect ran sideways. 2 words inverted, 1 missing entirely, sent without correction, because the correction would have cost 6 more seconds and 6 seconds were not available. Leavitt walked the corridor to the green room, with her chin level and her pace exact. A grip who passed her in the hallway later said she looked like someone walking through a building they were deciding whether to come back to. The clip that ran everywhere that night was 17 seconds. Leavitt's dismissal of the law degree. Crockett's pause, and then the folder appearing on the table. 17 seconds. No audio after the folder dropped. Just the visual of Leavitt's face completing its expression and then going somewhere else. It was viewed 9 million times by the following morning. Segmented into 14 independent pieces, each one finding a different audience at a different speed. Legal forums ran the statute citation Crockett had used in the hearing 6 months prior and matched it to the case summary's annotations. They didn't present it as a rebuttal. They posted it as a companion document. At 2:47 a.m., a news desk received an anonymous communication on matching letterhead from a former clerk connected to one of the original case files. Not naming Crockett, not claiming credit, simply confirming that the outcome described in the summary had been achieved entirely through statutory argument. No political connection cited, no administrative leverage, just the law argued correctly by someone who understood it at depth. The verification team confirmed the letterhead against Bar Association records within the hour. No way to dismiss it quickly. The public conversation that week was not about party positions. It was about what it means to build a career inside a system versus inside a courtroom. The different kinds of knowledge those environments produce, the different forms of accountability they impose. People were sharing the 17-second clip not as a political statement, but as a question about expertise and whether the dismissal of it is itself a kind of credential. The geometry of the argument, as Crockett had said, quietly, almost to herself, in the middle of a panel that most people had already dismissed as routine, does not change because the room changes. The statute says what it says. The case record shows what it shows. The folder on the table holds what it holds. And a law degree, earned in a courtroom rather than a briefing room, is not a punchline. It is a record of being tested, where being wrong has consequences. If this changed how you see power, hit subscribe. If it didn't, watch it again. The details you missed the first time are the ones that matter most. Notifications on. The next one drops soon.